Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sarah Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. I am so delighted today to be joined in conversation with Anjali Sharan. She has written the book Joyous Resilience, A Path to Individual Healing and Collective Thriving in an inequitable world. Anjali, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really appreciated having a chance to talk with you about your book and about your overarching work, looking at individual and collective healing, which is just so important. And one of the things that I really appreciated about your book and my understanding of your work as a whole is your focus on joy. You actually in the book talking about joy, but I'm hoping we can start there in our conversation today. Is there a particular practice of gratitude or joy that you would like to share as a way of starting our conversation?
Yeah, I love that you wanted to start there. I've been inviting people. I've been thinking about this time of year. There's going to be a lot of gatherings, I know, just from different traditions. And I know that people focus on gratitude, but I actually like this flavor of asking people what's bringing you joy these days or what's lighting you up, because it is a different flavor. I feel like it turns the notch up a little bit, like a slightly more fire. So yeah, I love being asked the question. And currently, one thing that is bringing me joy is actually following seasonality. I find that matching the season, playing with the season, getting into it, whether it's the kinds of foods or clothing or really ambiance. It's a little bit too early in California for me to be lighting a fire, but we had one rainy weekend right before the equinox, and I was like, it's a sign, I'm taking it, and lit the first fire and got into fall that way. So I think looking at the leaves, slowing down, cooking different things, they're all very tactile ways. I'm playing music that reminds me of autumn, whatever that means. Currently for me, it means medieval music from 1100 to 1200 or something, and lutes and harps. All of that actually does regulate my nervous system and get me into a particular mood. And I feel fall, for a lot of us, means kind of inward, coming in, savoring. So that's been a very simple but very tactile, very rich way of experiencing joy that I love and invite anybody into who gets inspired by that. Though I imagine many of the people who listen to your podcast, especially if you're into the environment, all of that, you're into seasons and cycles. So that might be a part of people's lives.
I like to hope so.
Yeah. And I'd also love to hear yours, if you felt open to share.
I love how you're this invitation to have gratitude and joy as part of the same, as like a similar practice of joys and practice of gratitude, and that thinking about the joyous quality of gratitude can kind of up our gratitude a little bit, and can really kind of take us to a deeper level of what we mean with gratitude. I love this season. We're sharing this conversation in the fall of 2022. And certainly here in the Northeast, in the Hudson Valley, in the historical homeland of Mohican peoples, we just have so much beautiful colors and changing of the seasons. And I just was at a amazing, phenomenal Northeast Council of Indigenous Peoples. It's a first meeting of the council about a week or two ago on Indigenous Peoples Day, which feels like a really long time ago already. And it was really a moment where there was a lot of joy and a lot of gratitude. And I could really feel that integration of personal and collective healing. And a lot of that was through ritual and through sharing and through stories. And it kind of like makes me wonder, like, what were some of the experiences that helped take you out of the lens of simply being, because so much of therapy is very individually focused, and what is it that kind of enabled you to go towards the collective?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think my first training, so I guess backing up, I entered therapy like a lot of people for, at least in my mind, it felt like individualized reasons. I was very young, I was about 22. And so, and I feel very privileged and lucky to have started my journey that young. And so coming in for anxiety, coming in actually for some fire, some like heat, some like anger and stuff that was erupting. I had come from my home country of like Pakistan at 18. So a couple of years had passed, leaving my family behind, my country of origin. And so I named that to say like that actually was a larger pressure. And there were some of the things that were causing me anxiety and anger were actually about the land that I grew up in, patriarchy, like systems of oppression and how they were coming out through my family of origin. But I didn't know all of that. I just knew I was anxious. I was getting into fights and my romantic relationship was not working out. And so I'm going into therapy going, okay, what's going on? And let me get some help. And what I will say is that those first number of years, now looking back, I realized not many people were also talking to me about so much how my individual concerns were rooted in those larger systems. I had a lot of anger around power and control. And yes, power and control can come up in family of origin or relationship, but power and control is also exactly how Pakistan and patriarchy and my religion were really working on, especially female bodies, right? And like producing all of this anger, anxiety, fight, resistance inside of me. But no one really talked about that. And the truth is, even without them talking about that over the next 4, 5, 6 years, much changed inside of me just from getting individualized focus on, okay, how do I manage my emotions? What's my anger telling me? What's my anxiety telling me? How do I translate anger and anxiety into actually needs and wants and boundaries? And then actually speaking them and, I'm shifting my relationships. So I say that just to say, yes, majority of therapy, especially back then and in my own training, at that point, I was also training to be a therapist and in my own therapy, was very much individually focused. And then I would say like grace or luck or timing. I was very lucky that pretty early in my training, I began to be trained by healers who were politicized healers. And so this was the work of generative somatics, Stacey Haynes, who was really doing trauma-based work, body-based work, but really talking about how your individual life history, your family of origin is one place, one container in which what's happening for you is formulated. But that container does not live inside of, an open field of like nothingness. That container lives inside of institutions, landscape, political systems, just so like larger factors, uh, history, time, place, context that shapes that family that you're growing up inside of, and then that shapes what's happened in your body. And I think getting that training early on was obviously incredibly powerful, right? I mean, it woke me up. It made it glaringly obvious that no one had spoken to this before. And then I think both because of the intersections that I hold, right, being an immigrant here, just like all these different things about holding different landscapes, holding different religions, what class I belong to, whether I'm able-bodied or not, how much education I've had, right? All of that, I think, was something important for me to take into account. All that meant that I actually needed a more nuanced lens. And so that lens actually helped me see myself much more deeply. And then the other part of it is ever since I began being a therapist, again, because of those identities and also because of my interest, the people that I work with straddle a lot of different cultures, religions, traditions, races, class, all of that. And so in my client stories, and then especially I would say in the past decade of working as a therapist in America in this political climate as it's been changing, it became not only obvious but apparent and like necessary to be able to speak to people about the pain that they were bringing in, because it wasn't just that the pain had this backdrop. It was that the pain was literally about the fact that the earth is being destroyed and the fact that Black bodies are being harmed and killed, and systemic racism is what has shaped this country, but it is now in our face. So the rise of fascism, the pain was actually central. Where I would say maybe a decade or more ago, the pain was always there. It was central depending upon who you were, what you were holding, but maybe it was still held as backdrop. And now I think it's become foreground. So there's a lot of different reasons why this model became very much interwoven in my work and my personal life, and now in the book.
Yeah, I'm really hearing that your own personal experience, and subsequently, as you were in therapy, and then as you kind of were recognizing the different intersections of your lived experience, as well as what you were hearing from your clients, and then coming into contact with trauma-informed approaches to our both individual and collective healing. And I, for what it's worth, it's everything you're saying resonates with my own experience as well. Mm-hmm. Especially in the last few years, I feel like more and more people are articulating more clearly that the pain that they're experiencing, the pain that they're suffering within themselves is very clearly connected to what's happening in the collective, and and it's hard, at least for me, it's hard for me to know how much of that is I'm hearing it differently and how much of it is being articulated differently, but it does feel that there is more and more awareness. Oh, this thing that is happening in my body is not just me. I'm not the only one.
I'm not the only one. And the thing that's occupying me is not necessarily just like my partnership, my job, or that my job and my partnership or my family is not so separate from, I mean, I think especially the like coronavirus, right? Like how could we even talk anymore about my personal life without talking about this large thing that's happening, because it was impeding every single aspect. And then it became very clear that, again, we're all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And so if your boat is more leaky, if you have to be on the front lines, if you've lost your job, if you don't have that kind of fail-safe financially, if you happen to live in a neighborhood where you don't have access to vaccines, like basically how race, class, gender, able-bodied, all of this stuff is affecting that larger external experience. It became impossible in a way, I think in a useful way. Like wake up for those of us who had, I include myself, like various privileges that have buffered me from recognizing this idea of like, there's a lot of pain and suffering in the world. And some of it is individual, but so much of it is systemic. And like, as we heal individually, taking that energy towards that systemic in order for real thriving to happen. Very different than Western wellness culture, which really is do for you and you'll be good.
And so much, and I'm just curious about this. You don't really go into your book so much about this, but like I'm also just thinking about the histories of how psychotherapy and marriage and family counseling is taught and the histories of where those theories are coming from, they very much treat the individual as an individual bubble.
Yeah.
The individual is not part of the collective, may be part of a family.
Yeah, exactly. Family is the beginning and the end.
Family is
Exactly.
the beginning and the end, right? That's a beautiful way of putting it. And to really recognize how false that bubble is.
Exactly. I mean, that's what I love about your work. I mean, I don't know so much about it, but I think Sarah, as like someone who like is tracking history. I mean, I think we're not taught that much history, right? Or maybe in school, but I think as a people, we're not. And I think as a therapist and someone who's very interested in history, but obviously as a not all an expert, I think having that broad lens, like even just what you said, what is the history of psychology? Where did it come from? Who were the people? These kind of white men in Europe and their understanding of I mean, it's amazing what they did and how far they went. It is true, but to look at the context that it was birthed inside of, and then how that context basically didn't even recognize certain people as people at that time, and how that has continued, or certain bodies is actually like real human bodies with full feelings, including just women's bodies. And like women as having all different kinds of feelings, emotions, sexuality, like equal to men. And then, forget about, of course, people of color, all of that. So yeah, it's so important to have historical context and perspective, and we're lacking that. And then to continue to evolve. And I do think that psychology, and I mean, especially in this country right now, I think it is evolving, is being forced to evolve. Right. And I'm glad for that there is more voice and there is more understanding, even in the clients coming in. And some of that thanks to social media, which is interesting to me because social media causes so much pain, and that's a different story. But I think this like a rise of like a lot of people having access. I see that even in like Pakistan when I go home because of Instagram, because of Facebook, right? Like there is this movement around social justice activism, understanding decolonizing bodies, decolonizing our thinking, and how those ideas are spreading much more rapidly. And I think people are realizing more and more that, hey, this thing I'm dealing with, please don't just blame me for it. Let's actually look at what's creating that and try to change things. So I think it is useful. But it's hard if there's a lot of space to actually process that. And practitioners and people and containers, and I don't just mean mental health therapists, I mean doctors and teachers, right? I mean, in every single field who are meeting this pain with, you're right, it's true, as opposed to being a source of that pain, by denying it or by perpetuating it.
And by not
go ahead.
And by not creating those institutional structures, which don't perpetuate it. I mean, so much is happening here on a structural level too.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would, maybe someday we'll have a healthcare system that does not perpetuate some experiences of trauma, but that's not where we are yet.
That is not where we are. Yeah, maybe.
So tell us a little bit. So you saw some of these connections, and then you did something really quite wonderful, right? As you started to create a more comprehensive, may I call it a theory, that based coming out of your experience, and you began experimenting with it. And you talk about this, you shifted from the victim triangle to the cycle of suffering to the cycle of resilience. So I'm wondering if you can kind of walk us through those basic concepts that have become the really foundational to how you're helping people navigate between internal and collective healing.
Mm-hmm. And I would encourage like anybody listening, I think it's easiest to integrate it. And maybe I would shift it from like theories like model or an actual experiential model. So as I'm talking you through it, like really just call something to mind right now that you're having a little bit of a struggle with. It doesn't have to be a huge, big deal, something you're anxious about, maybe a little bit irritated around, maybe you're like procrastinating on. And so what the model begins with is the cycle of suffering. The cycle of suffering is a way that you can understand what's maybe keeping you stuck when you encounter a difficult situation or a difficult emotion inside of you. So it's not that it's something wrong that you're feeling that difficulty. It's more what's keeping you stuck or maybe exacerbating it. And so where you'd begin is what I call the vulnerable self. And the vulnerable self is really just fancy speak for inside of you, the feelings and emotions that come up when you're having, right, fear, sadness, anger, shame, guilt, any of that, or even a physical sensation, a bit of a tightness, a little bit of a drop in the belly. So think of the situation where you're stuck and you might just notice for a moment, what are the sensations and emotions that go with it? And there you have it. That's your inner vulnerable self. Now, what happens, what I'm calling the cycle of suffering is that's not the issue. What actually causes distress, what causes lack of resilience, is how that experience is responded to. And there's two ways that you can break it down to simplify. One of them is, and the gesture there would be turning away from. So I imagine like our head just turns away, our body turns away from our heart and our belly. And that's the neglector. And so what that can look like, it has a few faces. It could look like I neglect myself by basically putting on a face of, I'm fine. Everything's fine with me. Tell me more about you. So many of us have this. I think especially female-bodied people, we're taught to like put your energy into everything else, the work, the house, the kids, our community, right? The whole world's on fire, needs my attention, but I'm okay. But you're saying that when you're actually not okay. It's almost like you're turning your head away from yourself and putting the energy there to avoid this feeling inside. So we can neglect ourselves in that way. We can also neglect ourselves in other phases of it. Could be people pleasing. So maybe I'm feeling a bit irritated in this interaction, but I have learned that it's wiser or smarter or safer probably to go, no, like nothing again is going on here. Like I'm okay. I'm not angry. I don't need anything. Like really just putting a smile on things basically. So people pleasing as a face of self-neglect. And then one more that's very common, and it can be all the way from losing ourselves in like alcohol or drugs, so like kind of like difficult substances of losing ourselves, all the way to social media, books, right? Any way that we check out. And again, nothing wrong with helping people, nothing wrong with knowing how to be diplomatic, and nothing wrong with taking a break. But the way that we're mindful of this is that if I'm having a sensation and emotion and I'm using these behaviors to turn away from it permanently or chronically, so that feeling builds, then I am actually in self-neglect. It's no longer in the realm of health. So that's one thing that we might do. And I'd like you to imagine if you are doing one of these things, like as you turn your head away, right, what happens to that feeling in the belly and the heart and in your body or that situation? And usually, hands down, what happens is a Band-Aid might happen. So like maybe in the morning, I'm so busy and all that I kind of forget about it, or it gets relegated to the back. And maybe I think I'm okay because I smiled about this one time you broke my boundary and whatever, it passed. But in the middle of the night, it comes up in terms of a constant rumination. Or the next time you break my boundary, now I'm a little bit more irritated. Or now I find that I'm avoiding you because I don't want to say no to you because I don't want to disappoint you. But I also then have to start avoiding your texts or not taking your phone calls because I'm afraid of confronting you and just saying that no, right? So the problem with this behavior is that it may give a short-term relief, but long-term, the vulnerable self gets even more vulnerable and even more distressed. So that's one thing that might happen that's producing suffering. Simultaneously or in response to this, the other thing that can often happen is the critic. And the critic has different faces. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's that finger pointing at ourselves, right? And that critic might take what's already happened and look at it and go, what's wrong with you? Why are you so anxious? Why are you having such a hard time either saying no or even wanting to say no, right? Like, shouldn't you just be available to the people who love you? If you really cared about them, you wouldn't want to say no. Why are you so tired? All those other people on Instagram are doing so many things and they don't seem to be tired, having a hard time juggling stuff. What about you? So, I mean, I see you nodding. I can smile about it. These things are very common. I just want to really normalize it and like let go of shame, because the critic produces shame. It tells you it's just you. And something wrong with you and everybody else is fine. And it's basically adding fire to this pain. And once again, as I described the critic, imagine what's happening to that inner vulnerable who really was just feeling anxious, who was feeling disappointed, who probably just had a bit of tightness because it needed to say no. But now that initial feeling is buried underneath a lot of avoidance. So maybe it's gotten lost, and a lot of criticism and shame. So it's really feeling like it's wrong and bad to even have these feelings in the first place. Now I'm inflamed again. Now I have to check out even more. So I have to neglect myself even more to deal with this level of pain. Then I have to criticize myself even more, so on and so forth. Hence, as you can imagine, this is a cycle. Like one thing leads to another, but unfortunately, it's all leading downwards. And I talk about that in a minute. It's a spiral downwards.
Right. So let's just, so we have, let me just say that we capture what you were saying. So we have the vulnerable self, which is it seems like just something about being human is that
Mm.
we are such vulnerable creatures. And then we have how do we respond to that vulnerable self? And then, two very common ways, one through neglect and one through critique. And both of those have a myriad of different ways that can look. The neglector can look in several different ways, from people pleasing to looking the other way, and but sometimes engaging with other forms of substance abuse, as also as a form of self-neglect or neglecting others. And then the critique, that kind of critical, judgmental part. And very common for this to happen is that you can go from the neglector to the critic in a vicious downward spiral.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right.
And do you think that we see those same trends socially as well, as like ways in which the institutions and society can neglect or be overly critical of our vulnerable parts of our society as humans?
I mean, yeah, exactly, right? I mean, I was just thinking that as I was describing this, because take a certain issue and where is this learned, basically, right? And I mean, yes, of course, yes, it's learned in family of origin. But again, what we're talking about from the beginning of the podcast is the family of origin does not exist in a vacuum. So where did family of origin learn this? And it can be very interesting, difficult, painful, but also interesting to look at and go eye-opening to see, did society mirror this response? So one example, I think, I'm thinking about just like illness. So I feel like illness is one of those moments in life like where we are most vulnerable, right? It's like that moment where like I cannot do for myself. And then talk about there's like illness and there's chronic illness. So now it's not even time bound. It's like this is part of me. It's part of my life, and I am profoundly in need of help. And I think that what I've seen, for myself around illness or for clients with chronic illness is how quickly it can turn into that critic. Number one, starting with something is wrong. Like I think with illness, the standard thing is what's wrong, as opposed to illness actually being like a part of the human condition or a part of life or bodies. That bodies, go through all different cycles and stages, and that maybe that your body's showing you something is needed, something wants support, something needs change. There are different lenses on illness. But what is wrong? Secondly, how can it be fixed? And then I think the stuck part is like if you have chronic illness, maybe it cannot be fixed. If fixed is like going back to some state where it was not. It really is, how can we be with this? But then, so that criticism of something is wrong. I mean, that is ableism. That is how society is structured. This is the system of ableism, all society structured around a particular way that a body can function. We should be able to walk. We should be able to climb stairs. We should be able to enter into rooms and have all kinds of fragrances and never get affected by them, I guess. We should be able to, I think just like move, breathe, work at a particular pace, produce at a particular pace, learn in particular ways, sitting down at a table, through books, standardized methods, like everything that we take for granted, and especially if you are listening to this and happen to be able-bodied, like it's so steeped. I mean, and I will out myself, I'm constantly learning through my clients, through my loved ones about, even as I myself get ill through COVID, like, hang on a second, this makes no sense. It only made sense when I was not in that vulnerable state. But now that I am, I recognize it doesn't make sense that I have to be ill and worry about the fact that my healthcare will not cover all of the things that now are going to happen. Talk about neglect. There's a system in place that basically says, oh, I guess if you happen to get sick, well, I mean, you're on your own and you should be able to somehow take care of that. Or even if it happens, it should happen sometimes only for a few days. And by the way, go back to work after 5 days of COVID. And if you don't, then you won't get paid. But okay, whatever. And oh, you got long COVID. We don't have any answers for that. And you're on your own and there's no unemployment for you. This is rampant neglect. And in it is rife criticism. What's wrong with you? You're a burden on the system. You just want to pretend. You just want to be lazy. I mean, anybody who I think has encountered a healthcare system for a long time, any form of where you cannot provide, you cannot do that thing that the system has taught you is the right thing. Work, get a job, earn enough money, have a home, pay your bills, forgetting about the fact that the system is not set up for any of us, majority of us, to even work 2 jobs and be able to afford rent. Once again, neglect. Once again, criticism. So the examples are, just in every system of oppression, you could look and find the neglector standing side by side with the critic, and the critic is strong and basically says, if you're feeling the brunt of the system of oppression, it's because it's your fault. It's because you didn't work hard enough, right? The system of like meritocracy, you just didn't do. And the idea of exceptionalism. Look at that person over there who happens to be the same race or class or gender or sexuality, but they made it according to certain standards, right? But that takes the exception and doesn't talk about the rule. And it again shames people and makes them think that the exception is actually the norm. And it's not. The norm is a system that's designed not to protect us in our vulnerabilities and then to put us down when we start to suffer. And in this country, and I think around the world, many, many people are suffering because of these very systems. So I love that question, Sarah. We don't usually talk about it, but that's why the book has all the examples that say, here's your individual life and here's the backstory. And let's start to look there. And then let's hopefully start to, keep on voting different, marching different, just doing whatever we can to start to shift the larger system, because it's not working in a majority of our favor.
And that moves us to the next model that you've been developing, which is the cycle of resilience, which has to do with enabling us to come out of the cycle of suffering, both at individual and at collective levels. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of walk us through how you have been able to kind of change this cycle of suffering and to kind of providing I think of it almost like a mirror image of a cycle of resilience.
Yeah. So the circle of resilience comes from, yes, it takes these three actors that we've already encountered: the vulnerable self, the critic, and the neglector. And first it says, okay, there you are in your vulnerable self again. So let's go back to whatever you were working on, right? That initial difficulty dilemma that you've been encountering. And this time imagine that instead of the head turning away, the neglector, there is some aspect of you that actually turns toward. So the nurture is that classic image, of like parent looking down at baby in the arms, that gaze, I'm holding your gaze. It's also could be an image or a feeling of like the hand on the heart or holding of a hand or a hand on the back. It's basically a movement towards. And the movement towards is coming with certain energies. The first one is really acceptance. Like, I am right here with you, and it is okay for you to be exactly as you are. And I want you just to feel that. I want you just to imagine whoever's listening, like even having that voice come towards you, whatever this anxiety or irritation or sadness is, just that the energy coming towards you is simply saying, we're not going to change it right this second. We're really just going to be with this and go, it's okay. It's most likely perfectly reasonable and okay for you to be feeling this way. And I'm going to be right here with you. And then the next moves are really like, as I'm here with you, I'm now deeply curious about this. And we have to be curious, because without that curiosity, I think curiosity is actually a deep part of love. We don't often think of it that way, but like, if I love you, if I'm bringing love towards you, it means that I have this acceptance. It means that I want to know you where you are. I don't want to put myself on you. I don't want to put my ideas, my preferences on you. I actually just want to invite you to share with me what's in there. So acceptance, curiosity, and then a deep sense of like, I want to be able to meet you now. Like, let's see what's in here so that we can be with it and assist it. And that's what the nurture, the opposite of a neglector is a nurture. It's building those kinds of skills and abilities to bring to ourselves. And of course, also societally.
So the neglector can kind of calm down and take a deep breath, and the nurturer can kind of take that place, and we can give ourselves that nurturing that our vulnerable self is needing.
Yeah, because you see, the neglector generally, it's always good to find out for ourselves, like why, like what service has it played in our lives to neglect? Because there's a reason, genuinely there's a reason, it's given you something. And a lot of times what it is like, that was the way that we learned to get this kind of love, so if I please you, if I do things for you, if I focus more on you, maybe then mom, dad, friend, teacher, lover, you will go, oh, what do you need? Or, oh, you're lovable, or I really like that. Like you'll sort of give me some attention. And so what we're doing is we're building a nurture that goes, okay, we don't have to do those things to get that. You have my attention already. And also I am learning to build the skill of tolerating feeling my feelings and being with those feelings. Because oftentimes society and family have all, society's taught us and families learned not to be able to tolerate the feeling of anxiety or grief. Grief is a great example. Societally, we should be over grief, like, oh, you lost somebody. Okay, you had a breakup. Well, what about the next one? And there's not a lot of ritual, as you were talking about, like ritual presence, capacity modeling of like being with an emotion, trusting that it can actually be moved through if you feel it, and that bringing that kind of acceptance is actually what helps it move. So the nurture, developing that individual therapy or group, however you learn it, is about learning to attune to ourselves, tolerate emotions, learn that they actually have things to offer us, and that we can ride those waves and we'll be okay. So there's a lot in building this nurturance. And that's just one part, right? That's the antidote to the neglector. But
and that thing you're saying about recognizing where it comes from is really important, and recognizing that whatever that neglect or critical person voice in your mind is that critique and that neglect comes from somewhere, and it has a purpose. And when we're thinking about that in terms of society, I think that kind of raises some really interesting questions about what is the purpose, what function does neglect play in society, and what does it mean for society to become more nurturing, and what are the different types of nurturing that society has become over time or has not become over time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, which parts of society are able to receive nurturing and which parts of society are not able to receive nurturing. I think all those are it's kind of interesting to kind of take those same set of questions and ask them at a more macro scale. But before we go there, I want to make sure we kind of get to just to kind of complete the understanding of the cycle of resilience. What is the almost the pair to the critic?
Yes. So there you are, right? Your vulnerable self is having this emotion. Now you're actually turning towards, and I always start with clients or with myself. I always start with a nurture, just by the way, before getting to the other aspects, because this is very important. Without that foundation of acceptance, curiosity, I'm turning towards, nothing else is actually possible. So I just want to say that it's a very basic foundational. We have to turn ourselves towards, we have to provide a condition of some safety, some welcome, for us to be able to engage with what's at hand. So as you bring that nurturing energy, then the other aspect is the protector. And the protector is coming in as an antidote to the critic. And it's basically, number one, drawing a line with the critic as well, and saying there might be real reasons why you thought that it was necessary to speak to yourself this way. And we can be with that. However, we're drawing a line in the sand. We're drawing a line around your own dignity, really saying this is not acceptable, right? I deserve, as much as anybody else, to be spoken to with respect. And that's one place that the protector can come in. Beyond that, the protector is also your champion. So it's coming in and saying, that thing that you were neglecting that probably was about like these feelings, and if there were any needs in it around boundaries, around a no that you needed to say, or a yes that you've been longing to have, or a pause that you needed, I am going to learn the skills to stand up and actually say those directly for you, right? Instead of you having to neglect and run away or, get like addicted to things, all of that, or people please, I'm going to come in and champion you. I'm going to come in and speak to these boundaries. I'm also going to come in with the skill set of direct requests. So asking for what you want, asking for help. If help has become shamed and taboo, right? The protector is really showing up and going, this is actually a part of strength, that I'm able to ask for help and engage and mobilize. So the protector is that part that really rallies for you in these kind of active ways. The nurturer is coming in and really taking care of your system. The protector is taking all of that and helping you engage with the world in ways that actually feel safe to you and also internally produces safety. And then, in the model and in the book, I talk about the soul self. And as you heard in the cycle of suffering, there's a vulnerable self and there's a neglector and the critic. And it's this, when you see the model in the book, you'll see a picture, it's a downward spiral. And it kind of looks like a hole in a way, because it really is like there's a hole in us when we're in that cycle of suffering, because we do feel alone, and we do generally feel very cut off from our own spirit, from our connection to just a larger world. It really feels as if we are on our own. This is the only one this has ever happened to. And there's nothing outside of us that can bring us out of it really fully. And the reason why the soul self was brought in is for two reasons. One, because of what Sarah and I were talking about, I noticed in the past number of years that some of the things that people were coming in with, the pains, were bigger than their individual lives and actually needed something bigger than even their own personal nurture or protector to hold that level of pain. Their nervous system needed regulating by something much larger. So in that case, if I have a grief that's about this world, it's about climate change, and maybe only Mama Ocean can hold the amount of tears that I have. Maybe I need to sit with that vast a body. Or maybe it's the arc of time and history of the universe that lets me feel like life goes on, because I feel so uncertain about my own life, or I need to really rest against the strength of a tree and feel that we share DNA, and that I am interconnected with more beings than human beings, because human beings can also be a source of dysregulation as much as they can provide co-regulation. So one reason I brought the soul self, and as you can see, it's a pretty expanded version. It does not have to mean religion, though for some people it can. It really means any way that you connect with something vaster than your own body. Any way that you feel interconnected with all that is. So it was for the reason that I just named, and also because it is through that connection to something larger that shame dies away, and that we come out of the cycle of suffering of aloneness, separateness, into I am a part of, I am part of interbeing. Many other people, many other beings have felt this thing that I am feeling. When I do healing on myself, it does ripple out to other people, and other people can bring that to me. And not other people, I would also say like animal beings, right? And nature. There are vaster ways of moving this thing beyond myself. So that's why in my experiential work with clients and my own personal journey, I realized something is needed that reconnects me, that reminds me, remembers that we are a part of something larger, and that is something the vulnerable self needs to be able to turn into the resilient self. So in the circle of resilience, the vulnerable self, because it has been nurtured and protected and soulfully connected to, it is no coincidence that at that point, your vulnerable self might go, well, maybe I can do it, or I've released a lot of that anger, or wow, I actually feel better about myself, or I want to try things, or I feel hopeful. And even I have the energy back to play and experience joy and be silly and have fun, because of course, if we're responded to in those ways, health begins to return. And we feel safe enough to try some of these things and rise, which is the definition of resilience, right? How do you withstand stress? When something happens, how do you actually get back up from that and keep moving? And it's very hard to get back up in a cycle of suffering, because it's really just pummeling you down. But in the circle of resilience, you only rise because of how you're responded to. So it's a process.
That's really beautiful. I feel there's a piece that I was sort of particularly enjoying as you were describing it this time, which has to do with, I think one could in some ways say that one's inner protector and champion and one's inner nurturer feels like almost like a little bit of a stereotypical, like an internal mother and father kind of role.
Sure, you could gender it if you want.
If one wanted to gender it. But what I'm hearing also that you're doing is to not only kind of build that kind of internal parental capacity for oneself, but to add in the soul self, not as the only part of who you are, because you kind of keep that resilient self as kind of the core of who a person can be, but to kind of recognize that we need that to kind of fully enter a cycle of resilience, like the role of that soul self, as well as the role of a sort of parental parts of ourselves and of our own capacity for self-nurture and our own capacity for protection. The critical piece of connecting to that which is beyond us as individuals as part of what can actually enable resilience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and even with the nurture, Sarah, I'll just say if someone's listening to this and they're like, I don't know how to access that, or maybe some people have a strong soul connection way before they have a strong nurturing and protective connection. And so, just recently working with somebody, and it's like we try every which way to access it from themselves, and it's really hard. And what we discover is like for a while, they really need to work with, for like this person, it was some divine figure that wouldn't even expect that they would choose this one. It just came from their psyche. But leaning into that divine figure, let them experience a particular kind of nurturance that no matter how much we try, even though we know if they're experiencing it in their imagination through this divine figure, of course it's a part of them. But it's easier to access by putting it outside of them in this figure. And so that's a way to access nurturance that overlaps with the soul self. So I just say that to say, you can go to the ocean and have her be your mom nurturer. And you can go to the element of fire and have it teach you about protection, right? They're not so static. You get to play with this in different ways. It's just different energies that we do need to embody. I have found, it's obviously an experience. It's a constant lab. But what I found is these are energies that when embodied do help us thrive. And that they kind of fall into these neat boxes. They have lots of flavors inside of them, and they can all be experienced through the soul self, in that, but then they're integrated with as a part of us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I remember that when I first began learning polyvagal theory and about the trauma and the way in which the body can regulate itself. And I started and I noticed that so many of the things that people refer to for regulation, sometimes it could include chanting, and it can include humming and singing and spending time with nature and stretching and engaging with animals, which you include many of these, as well as rest and movement and beauty. These are all aspects of religious and spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
And it's like each religious and spiritual tradition has usually taken a collection of these and incorporated it into their practices as a way, I think partly what that's serving is as a way of enabling us to re-regulate and to come into our bigger selves and to kind of have access to that soul self in order to kind of move out of this tightness that the critic and the neglector can lead us into that downward spiral.
That's right. No, I love that you brought polyvagal theory. I don't know if any of the listeners know it, but yes, exactly. This model dovetails exactly with that. And for those who are listening, right, it's basically just your nervous system. And so the sympathetic, that like fight flight, that is definitely your critic and your neglector in a way. Right? I'm gonna run away and avoid this, or I'm gonna really like fight and get angry and put you down about it. And how do I help come back into ventral vagal, which really is just safety and connection. And everything we just said, that nurturing, protective, soulful energy is just helping you come back into safety and connection instead of in that fight flight state, or instead of the dorsal state, which is really collapse. That's what happens to the vulnerable self. Criticize enough, neglect enough, you're going to collapse. You're going to feel like, I just can't. I feel paralyzed. I feel hopeless and helpless. But if you get there, what this is saying, and also what polyvagal is saying, is that is not your fault. It is simply about a way that your system is being responded to. In that case, your nervous system, in this case, we're just describing it as roles, and then that can be shifted by a different response that produces more safety, produces more connection, that co-regulates, that doesn't require it all on your own. That's also where the soul self is helpful, or leaning into pets, leaning into music, leaning into a loved one, a spiritual figure, you name it, is important. If you can't do it for yourself, we use another body that actually provides that energy to help bring us back into balance. And that's very important, I think, in a culture that, again, talks a lot about independence instead of interdependence. So that's not dependency. It's very healthy.
And as part of that, I'm wondering if we can think about what has this taught you about what does it mean to build a more resilient society?
I mean, I think, one, it's taught me, I'm really grateful, like I said, right, like to have had that early training. And then ever since then, like it's taught me that like I think when I'm reading the news, like whether it is starting from the big picture, if I'm reading the news, I'm thinking about like bigger events to understand, like what you were saying, Sarah. I loved all those questions you shared about how to think about things, how to think about like, how has it served society to neglect? How has it served society to criticize? Like to understand that that system, that large system, is also a system of pain. And yes, it may have served some, right? Like whoever designed these systems, they're also in pain in a way, even if they're blocked from it. They have gotten so cut off from humanity, so cut off from feeling or sensation, so lost that is getting played out, right? I mean, gosh, I'm just thinking about this talk I heard recently. I think it was Tara Brach, and she's telling a story about, the pain of one little boy who basically whose mother is mentally ill, and the doctor happens to be Jewish and he can't save her. And this boy is, bullied a lot in school because of he has bad blood, quote unquote, because his mom was in a relationship that was considered incestuous. And she's telling this story about this boy's pain, and that boy grew up to be Hitler. And that boy grew up to translate that pain projected onto a vast scale, distorted scale, right? Of like purification, cleaning out of bad blood, vendetta. It was horrifying to hear, but it was also, I was so glad to tell that story in that way, because I think when we look at systems, we forget that people design systems, and that those people who are designing the systems are these two models. We could look at them and go, yeah, what's happening in your cycle of suffering? And how did you, whatever time, place, events that gave you that much power, that your pain did not just get played out in your family or in your workplace, but actually because of the political, title you hold, the amount of money you have, you name it, you actually get to play that pain out in the world. So I think it's just helped me like look at things in this idea of like there's people behind the systems and there's hurt. And then to really think about, I mean, it's not my field, but to really think about like, yes, what are the pieces of work that help a society start to shift, a society begin to confront the pain that it's caused instead of neglecting that pain. A society begin to confront and go, we've gotten cut off, right? White supremacy has cut us off from our humanity. And yes, it brings up a lot of shame to have to look at it, and a lot of defense and fear. But how do we provide containers in our schools, in our churches, in our backyards, on TV, like everywhere that go, we're going to turn to words. We're going to turn to words. And I mean, I think we're far from that in a way. Or we're in a moment of like, I hope that reckoning can happen. But that reckoning did not happen in this country, right? Like, oh, slavery's ended. Oh, civil rights happened. Okay, it's over. And not looking at like, we never turned around and talked about why did this happen? What were the historical roots? How is it living in our bodies? How do we begin to feel that pain, right? With a proper nurturance? How do we begin to have healthy protection around how that pain can act itself out? How do we move towards soulful practices that open us to this history and transform it and actually become as one instead of, sugarcoating or like just kind of spiritually bypassing and going, we're all just one people. So it's very complex, but I think what this work has done is made me at least think about these things in this way. I think that's necessary as a human being. And in this and at this time to go, it's not enough one-on-one. Something bigger is happening. It has long, long roots, and it will need deeper change through this process of as a nervous system turning to words. Turning to words as a people, as society. I do think it's happening in groups for sure.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? The small groups often act as there's an in-between space between the individual and the society. Exactly. And I know that you work with small groups as well as with individuals, and I also work with small groups as well as with individuals. And I have, no question that in circle and in small groups, there is so much healing that can happen, and that we can begin to suss out some of this collective stuff. We can begin to untangle some of these often debilitating tangles.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And I know we talked about that when we spoke earlier, like the dance between individual and like some collective work. And I would say like when I began my therapy, I think I'd mentioned to you, I was very lucky again to have individual and group. And I learned early that they provided different things. There is something, of course, about a special space just for you where you get to have all the time and attention to unpack what's happening for you. And that's very necessary. But for some of these bigger things, especially when there's been interpersonal hurts, right, or hurts around race, class, gender, like where we like hurt each other. Yes, I think sitting together with other people who have the same lived experience is profoundly healing. It's very necessary actually to come out of that aloneness again. And I also think you're right. Like we need a certain size of something, like the right size container to do certain kinds of process work. Like policy changes at large levels will produce a big change, but maybe those policy changes are driven by I did individual work, and I also sat in small enough groups where I could actually work through some of this, where I could actually be felt and seen and heard and deeply move this out. And then my system realized I do feel more integrated, and now my activism, my policy change work, my getting on the school PTA, my getting people out for like votes, like my working in the healthcare system and striking is coming from a more resilient, more just more like organized body inside, and a body that also has groups to go back to, because that fight is a long fight, right? In some ways, in individual and in group, you can actually get a lot of healing, I think, and move things through much faster than that larger systemic fight and change. But to keep the resilience alive for that, you do need those groups and places you can come back to. And be fed by and then go back in again. So I hope again for all of us, we keep looking for those places.
I run an anticipation group, and we go a lot between the individual and the collective in that. And there's a lot of beautiful questions around what are we anticipating? And it comes out of the work. Most everyone in it has taken my remembering courses. And what I find, one of the many things that I find about that, which at this point it's just a beautifully they kind of have self-organized, but is the way in which being with each other's stories over time, we can hear each other's stories over time. We can hear each other shift and change, to have loss and heartache and deep sorrow as well as deep joy. And by hearing those collective stories over time, it helps both normalize, and it helps us take more courage. It helps us feel our own power and feel our own agency, to stretch ourselves and we carry each other's stories with us in so many ways. And those stories can sometimes act as counter stories to other things we may have learned in other places and other points in time.
That's right. Yeah, and I think also like because you really teach like historically, I think it's also helped me at times like read either people's journals or people's stories of like who were in those difficult times and what they did, and they did take action, like just to realize like, okay, like if you did it and maybe in conditions that were much worse, then maybe I can too. So I love that, like learning from each other in real time, but I think also learning from ancestors, learning from those that have gone before, because I mean, I guess in some ways I would say I've read society has gotten maybe like topically, superficially, or maybe a little bit more than that, actually has become more nurturing. I mean, if you go back to like medieval times and all that, it's like, okay, there are ways in which things have shifted. So I think taking heart from that, remembering, that change is happening, and also that people did keep fighting for joy. People did keep loving and living and learning and creating through all of this history. And it's remarkable. And we're in that moment now. Again, we're always in that moment. We're definitely in that moment now.
And certainly in European history, I often am reflected at the moment of colonization. The native people in this land were much healthier, much stronger, much better fed. They had a much better diet. They had a much healthier lifestyle than their European counterparts. And they often had forms of governance that were far more democratic, and how much Europe actually has become much more like Native America than like some of its own history. And there's many different ways in which you have evidence of that, but it's something it's a story that's not told very often, of the extent to which Europe changed, and America changed, like what America became. But Europe itself changed and became far more, its capacity to engage with equality and freedom grew tremendously through its encounters with particularly Native America, but with many folks around the world. And then, of course, it went through a long process to get there, but and it is still going through a long process. But we often sometimes, I think, discount how much was learned.
Oh,
And
absolutely. I mean, talk about forgetting instead of remembering,
oh,
right?
so
Like
much
a
forgetting.
deliberate forgetting or conscious forgetting. I love that you're sharing that. That's fascinating. And yeah, sounds like so important to actually hear more and more of that. But yeah, I think it's a profound forgetting or even denial, deliberate denial and cutting off of having learned anything, much less democratic values from
Yep, democratic values come straight from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as many other Native folks. And the image I'm getting as I'm talking to is like to recognize that, we have our to really expand beyond, not just beyond the nuclear family and our own ancestors, but also to expand that, to understand that collective, that circles, the many, many circles that we are a part of, and that those circles have a spherical dimension. They have a multi-dimensional temporal dimension, and we can engage with both the more than human world as well as our ancestors in creating those circles of care for ourselves and for one another.
That's beautiful. I love it. Like a hologram. And yes, so true. Across time and space, right? Across time and space, past and present and future.
Yeah.
I do believe that. Yeah. We're informing both ways.
Which sounds like a wonderful entry to joy, into the fullness of life. And so we can kind of come back to, we started with joy, and we can kind of end our session together with the fullness of life and the fullness of past, present, and future, and the joyfulness that is inherent in that.
Yeah, and I think naming that, I love what you said about the people here in this land, America, like we're thriving before the Europeans came their way. And I think this idea of joy, I'd say, is like that, like joy, I guess if you look back, right, inside of our bodies that we've had access to and have been playing with what brings joy from the very beginning, from the artwork that's in the caves that we find, right, like prehistoric artwork, to the sculptures, to the first poetry, to the like cosmology, to dance, to all the rituals that certainly over time became organized religion, but organized religion took from, whatever, like millennia of ritual and practice. And this, I mean, for me, it's fascinating. It's like, where did it come from? It seems like it's a part of us. I would call it the soul self. We call it something else, but it's like that spirit inside of us that wants to express and that knows how to allow the body to come alive and find its way to thrive. And when I talk about joy in the book, or in my groups and all that, joy is not a one-pointed emotion. It's actually a spectrum. And the way I think of joy is closest to aliveness. So the ability to actually let your whole spectrum of being, your whole spectrum of emotions be allowed, be accepted, to move through you and to feel yourself come alive in that. And we have done that through so many different means. And I mean, psychotherapy and therapy is like, I guess on that millennial arc, like we're like a few minutes in or a minute in or a second into this particular way of working with your psyche and finding what brings you alive. But to really remember and ask ourselves, our bodies will tell us what makes us sweat, what makes us release, what makes us laugh, what makes us, feel our sensations, what opens our hearts, and to just move towards that and to keep working, I think, to transform or like upturn this more recent idea in the past hundreds of years of like capitalism going, you have to buy it, you have to achieve it, you have to get it somehow from outside of yourself, as opposed to it's a lived experience inside of you. And you just keep coming back to that and remind your children of that and remember that in your circles, that no one can take it from you in that way. It's inside. And how do we craft it for ourselves and craft again, like something in our hands, something that we produce? Let's make it more normalized. Let's make it more about like little moments instead of some peak experience, which that's also happened in society. When you get married, when you achieve that thing, when you hit these many followers, as opposed to when you smiled when the sun hit your face and you sighed in relief. When you lay in bed and you like got really cozy. It's little moments and savoring that, and that's a path back to wellness, knowing we're whole and knowing that we're connected. And it's very important it's been relegated to the back burner, something to do maybe, when everything else is settled, as opposed to something to weave through really all of our days and all of the work that we do as essential.
It reminded me of a session I had with a client recently, and we had her turn her attention instead of inwards into herself. I had her turn her attention out into the natural world around us. We were working outside, and I had her go and ask each of kind of go and talk to the tree and talk to the antlers and talk to the bones and talk to the stones and just inquire of everything around her. Was she okay? And were we as a whole okay? Just kind of let the answer come from outside in this plane, this natural world, as well as from inside of herself. And she just kind of came back with this like look of bliss on her face after a few minutes. And so now we're working on like kind of like I'm thinking of it as you're describing it, as you were talking, like we could call it the nature joy journal. Like what is it that nature is telling you today? What are the, maybe it's a lesson in the balance between life and death. Maybe it's a lesson in cycles. Maybe it's a lesson in how purifying cold can be, or what a blessed fire can be, or the danger of that which is gone out of even. But like each day we're always being gifted joys and being gifted part of this world that we're in. So like, what are some of those, bullet, like kind of like a gratitude journal, but with like a joyful nature journal. What are you learning today? What are you being told today that can, as you're just saying, bring us closer to that craft of our life?
That's so lovely. Thank you for sharing about that session. Yeah, I never go wrong talking to those beings out there. They seem to have a eternal connection to joy, as in like life. I was just kind of tapped in right now at the trees outside. What I heard was like, we will go on. Life will go on. Like something will continue. It feels like a non-attachment to a particular form of life, though. It's like life energy will go on. And I think in that sense, yeah, like life moves towards life. That's a quote I really love. Like life keeps moving on towards life and things will continue to evolve. How will we add to that stream, I guess, today? What will bring us joy?
How can we more deeply settle into it and let it carry us instead of trying to be, we don't have to do the carrying all the time.
Oh, I love that. I need to hear that. Thank you.
Me too. I need to say it. Well, and I think that feels like a beautiful note in this conversation with. So thank you so much, Anjali. Thank you for your dedication to this work and to your own personal path, as well as your really attentiveness to your clients and to the work and to the bigness of it all, and not letting the bigness of the questions stop you. I think sometimes people say, "Oh, that's too big. I can't go there," but you didn't. You really let yourself engage with that, and that's just it's yielded. Such a beautiful approach, and I'm sure that I know people already are finding what you are offering to be tremendously helpful. I think I'll just say this, that one of the so it's very sweet things about this book is it has a lot of exercises that you can do by yourself. So that can be, I think for a lot of people, that kind of, it's not really, I wouldn't call it a workbook. But it does have a lot of like, try this and try this and try this, which is really nice. It's really nice to kind of be able to not just read stories, but also try practices for yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was meant to be a path that someone can follow for themselves or with their therapist or coach or whoever you're working with. But yeah, it was definitely meant to be like, take this now and like, let's walk together is written in that way. Let's walk together. And I think you will share this in the notes, but for anybody listening, if you like what you heard, or even if you aren't reading the book, if you want to engage with any of these archetypes, the nurturer and the protector and the soul self, there's 9 free meditations that you can just get from the website. Sarah will link it, and they will give you an experiential way of interacting with this and a taste of the book as well. And I hope that's of use. And Yeah, and thank you so much, Sarah, for having me and just for this really like gentle. It felt like a conversation where we're like in a river. Like I felt like I was in a riverbed flowing through, and there's these places where these like deep rocks, and we're kind of just kind of there for a moment in this depth in this pool, and then we move forward. And you bring a wonderful just energy to the conversation and a lot of expertise. So thank you for the work you do too.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I like rivers and oceans and deep places.
Me too.
Well, in this work of remembering and re-enchanting, may we keep finding those deep places that nurture us and that fill us with joy and wonder even at the confusion and the craziness of it all, that we can still know that we are being carried. Thank you so much, Anjali.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Samanvaya website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarahjolina.com.